What happens when a country that has long been seen as one of the world's most welcoming societies suddenly turns its back on the very policy that helped define its national identity? In less than 3 years, Canada has gone from planning to welcome 500,000 permanent immigrants annually to slashing immigration targets, tightening visa rules, and passing legislation that gives the government the power to cancel large numbers of immigration documents whenever it considers doing so to be in the public interest. So what caused one of the world's most immigration-friendly countries to change course so dramatically? And who is ultimately paying the price? We're witnessing one of the fastest and most significant immigration policy reversals in modern Canadian history. Just a few years ago, Ottawa viewed immigration as an essential engine of economic growth. But by 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government had committed to reducing temporary residents to below 5% of Canada's total population, while stabilizing permanent immigration at levels far below the ambitious targets of previous years. This isn't simply a policy adjustment. It's a deliberate reversal that is reshaping how millions of people see their future in Canada. The story really begins during the COVID-19 pandemic. While much of the world closed its borders, Canada moved in the opposite direction. Ottawa dramatically expanded temporary foreign worker programs and welcomed record numbers of international students to accelerate the country's economic recovery. Permanent residency targets climbed from roughly 341,000 people in 2019 to more than 437,000 in 2022, with plans to reach 500,000 annual admissions by 2025. At a time when many countries were restricting immigration, Canada was rapidly expanding it as part of its recovery strategy. But that's only part of the story. What many people overlooked at the time was that the government wasn't only increasing permanent immigration, it was also aggressively expanding temporary foreign worker programs and international student permits. Because these groups weren't counted under the official permanent residency targets, their numbers grew at an extraordinary pace. By mid-2023, Canada's population had officially surpassed 40 million people, with almost all of that growth driven by immigration. Population growth reached one of the fastest rates among developed countries, rivaling levels not seen since the post-World War II baby boom. However, rapid population growth doesn't automatically translate into greater prosperity, especially if infrastructure fails to keep pace. And this is where the cracks began to appear. As early as 2022, officials inside Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada were already warning that housing construction simply wasn't keeping up with population growth. Internal government documents acknowledged that Canada's population was expanding much faster than its housing supply, and warned policymakers that this growing imbalance needed to be addressed. Yet those warnings received little political attention for nearly 2 years until the consequences became impossible to ignore. What surprised many observers was how quickly public opinion shifted. For decades, Canadians had been known for maintaining broadly positive attitudes toward immigration. But by late 2023, more than half of Canadians surveyed believed immigration levels had become too high. According to a Leger poll, 53% said immigration levels were excessive, while only 28% believed the current level was about right. By 2025, attitudes had shifted even further. Internal research commissioned by Canada's Immigration Department found that more than 2/3 of Canadians believed new immigration would negatively affect the housing market. Similar numbers believed immigration was placing excessive pressure on public services, while a majority also agreed that immigration was driving up local housing prices. But is immigration really the primary cause of Canada's housing crisis? This is where the story becomes considerably more complicated than many social media debates suggest. Many economists and housing experts argue that immigration is only one factor, and perhaps not even the largest one. While immigration undoubtedly increases housing demand, many researchers believe its effect on housing prices is significantly smaller than public perception suggests. Instead, they point to decades of underinvestment in affordable housing, real estate speculation, restrictive zoning regulations, and slow housing construction as the deeper structural causes of Canada's housing shortage. But politics doesn't always follow economic analysis. Public perception often matters more than academic consensus, and that political reality increasingly shaped government policy. There's another factor that many people overlook. The policy reversal wasn't driven solely by housing pressures. It was also driven by politics. The Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre, increasingly made immigration one of its central campaign issues, arguing that immigration should be tied directly to Canada's ability to provide housing, healthcare, and infrastructure. That placed enormous pressure on the governing Liberal Party, which had traditionally championed higher immigration levels. For most of the past quarter century, immigration had been one of the rare issues that enjoyed broad cross-party consensus in Canadian politics. That consensus has now largely disappeared. The result was a series of significant policy changes. Permanent residency targets were reduced from the previous goal of 485,000 to 395,000 for 2025, before falling further to 380,000 in 2026 and 365,000 in 2027. At the same time, Ottawa committed to reducing temporary residents, including international students and temporary foreign workers, to below 5% of Canada's total population by the end of 2027, down from more than 7% at its peak. To reach these goals, the government introduced numerous technical reforms. Provincial allocations for international students were reduced. The express entry system eliminated bonus points for arranged employment in an effort to reduce fraud, and minimum work experience requirements for certain priority categories increased from 6 months to 1 year. But perhaps the most significant turning point came in March 2026. The Carney government introduced Bill C-12, legislation that substantially strengthened the government's authority over Canada's immigration and refugee systems. The bill gives the federal government new powers to manage immigration documents, including visas, electronic travel authorizations, work permits, and study permits, allowing officials to respond more quickly during emergencies. More specifically, whenever the government determines that it is in the public interest, immigration authorities can suspend, cancel, or modify large numbers of immigration documents simultaneously. The legislation also allows the government to pause accepting new applications or temporarily stop processing existing ones. Meanwhile, Canada's asylum system also became considerably stricter. Individuals who apply for asylum more than 1 year after entering Canada, or those who enter irregularly through the U.S. land border and submit claims more than 14 days later, can no longer have their cases referred to the Immigration and Refugee Board under the new rules. This brings us to perhaps the most important question: who actually benefits from these policy changes? For many Canadian voters struggling with soaring rents, expensive housing, and overstretched public services, stricter immigration policies create the impression that the government is regaining control. Politically, they also help shield the governing party from mounting criticism by the opposition. Some employers, particularly in rural communities facing chronic labor shortages, also benefit from specific policy adjustments. Beginning in April 2026, employers in eligible rural areas were allowed to increase the share of low-wage temporary foreign workers in their workforce from 10% to 15%, helping businesses fill positions that have become increasingly difficult to recruit domestically. But the largest burden falls elsewhere. Hundreds of thousands of international students, temporary workers, and asylum seekers now face greater uncertainty about their future. Unlike Canadian voters, they have little political influence, despite being directly affected by these decisions. Some advocacy groups argue that rather than addressing the structural causes of Canada's housing crisis, inflation, and inequality, politicians have increasingly turned immigrants into convenient political targets. After all, blaming people who cannot vote often carries fewer political risks. Many experts also warn that Canada may be experiencing a generational shift in public attitudes toward immigration. Anti-immigrant rhetoric has become increasingly common, while many newcomers report experiencing growing discrimination and hostility. However, reducing immigration also carries substantial economic risks. For years, rapid population growth helped prevent Canada's economy from slipping into recession despite persistently weak productivity growth. Reducing the number of temporary residents means that roughly 2 million people may eventually leave Canada as their visas expire, according to estimates from the Fraser Institute. Whether Canada's immigration system has the administrative capacity to manage a transition of that scale remains highly uncertain. If the government ultimately fails to achieve its targets, Canada could still experience stronger than expected population growth. But if it succeeds, the country may enter one of its slowest periods of demographic expansion in decades, with economic consequences that even policymakers admit remain difficult to predict. So what happens next? In the short term, Canada will likely continue tightening temporary immigration while prioritizing highly skilled workers who match specific labor market needs rather than pursuing rapid population growth. But the longer-term challenge remains unresolved. Canada's population continues to age. Birth rates remain historically low, and its labor force increasingly depends on the very immigrants that many Canadians now want to limit. If political pressure continues pushing immigration policy toward even tighter restrictions, the real question may no longer be whether Canada should reduce immigration. Instead, it may be whether the country is sacrificing its long-term economic growth for a short-term political solution. And perhaps the bigger question extends far beyond Canada itself. If a country once regarded as the global model for well-managed immigration has decided to reverse course under mounting public pressure, what does that tell us about the limits of openness in a world increasingly shaped by housing shortages, rising living costs, and political polarization? If you found this analysis valuable, consider leaving a like. It helps us know you'd like to see more in-depth breakdowns of complex global issues like this. Thank you for following this story. If you found it interesting, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it. For now, this is goodbye. Thank you for staying with Societale Stories.